working on multiple levels, which is kind of like why we put this together. And it's going to be something we're going to be dealing with for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Hopefully not that long, and some of these things will be decided sooner rather than later because they're so critical to, it's the foundation of our economy. We are an innovation and software-driven economy, and if we don't do some due diligence, so to speak, and start to tighten up our security, we're going to be at risk. I always think about this. We were at Full Contact just a little while ago, last year. We're going to be a presenter potentially at Full Contact this year. And this fall, on September 22nd, we are going to be bringing over the Executive Director of WTIA, Michael Schuessler, and he's going to be talking about Full Contact and how it relates to the community and the workforce. And really, so it's really about inspiring with the next generation what we are going to need to have as capacity. And it's not a simple, straightforward solution. It's not like, hey, the tech economy is just going off the rails and it's going to be great, and you know, we don't have to do anything. We have to do a lot of work. And if I'm reminded, just go to Detroit. Detroit was at the top of the world when the auto industry was at its peak, and now look at them. They are suffering. And so I'm not saying that's going to happen to Seattle. In fact, I do everything I can to make sure it doesn't. But the point is, you know, just because you're successful now doesn't mean you're always guaranteed success in the future. And I think something like Full Contact was talking about a lot of the issues that the tech economy has in different areas, even though it's taken hold. Like, for instance, San Francisco's got some huge issues. A lot of people I know are leaving California and going to other places because they just can't. The market doesn't work with them. So, with that ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand the floor over to Jonathan Friebert.
Thank you.
And go from there.
All right. Well, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Donia, for having me out. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, as Charles mentioned, about, I think, some of the critical public policy issues that are impacting not just the technology industry, but I think society at large as a whole today. So I'm going to touch upon a couple of them as I speak to you. But just by way of background, I've been at Microsoft for 10 years now. I work in the U.S. government affairs area. So I have colleagues based in Washington, D.C., as well as in several state capitals around the country. Additionally, on my team, I also have some policy experts that really go deep on several issues, including cybersecurity, education reform, telecommunications. So we have a team of about 45 people across the U.S. focused on some of these areas. And so what I do as part of being on the external affairs team, as Charles mentioned, is that I manage a program called Voices for Innovation. So go to the next slide. And so really what Voices for Innovation is about is we really work at this intersection of public policy, technology, community, and business. We're a community made up where I look to focus on, first and foremost, are either Microsoft business partners, mostly small to mid-sized companies, as well as anyone who's in the technology sector and cares about some of these public policy issues. So I'm looking, and really what we want to do is help folks get involved and talk about these issues with elected officials or community leaders. And so we really want to work to educate people who care about these issues, as well as make it easy for them to engage. And so on our website, which I'll have at the end of our presentation, we have several ways for you to get involved and communicate with your elected officials about some of the issues that I'm going to talk to you about today that hopefully you'll find some interest in wanting to talk about. So, next. So, again, we have right now about 90,000 people involved with BFI as part of our community across the country. Aside from those who are business partners, we also have a number of people that, again, care about some of these policy issues, as I think a number of these, what we used to consider, I would say, 9, 10 years ago, issues really focused within the technology community have gotten much broader. So when you talk about privacy, when you talk about education and educating the future for this data-centric economy that we're moving towards, these are important issues that more people care about. So It's free to join. And as you can see, Donia has joined us. This was a trip that we did to DC back in October to talk about this issue that I'm going to talk with you about today, which is cloud privacy and updating our outdated laws when it comes to this topic. Next slide. Okay, and you can build it. So I wanted to start, I hope people, it's a little hard to see now, sorry. I wanted just to frame up this, this issue with questions, at least questions that I'm hearing from a number of our Microsoft partners. You know, questions around the cloud. Where will my growth come from? Will my business suffer because of customer distrust of their data in the cloud? Is my data safe in the cloud? You know, these are questions that I think, you know, not only customers are, I guess the white lettering wasn't good with the background there. Note to self, it looks good on my smaller screen. So, you know, these are questions that I know a number of our Microsoft partners are getting from their customers, and I know consumers are asking these questions as well, especially when you think about some of the data breaches that have happened. But there's also, you know, a darkness, I think, around these clouds. You know, to drive business growth and innovation, what is that appropriate balance between privacy and security? How will pending legislation affect my business, my customers, my competitors' business? What business losses might I suffer if this murky legal landscape remains unsolved? And really, you know, the issue, I'd say one of the primary issues right now is that, again, in this data-centric economy, digital content is borderless. Digital content can be stored anywhere in the world by anyone at any time. And so governments are trying to figure out how to think about that, and companies are trying to figure out how you navigate this legal landscape when you have different and conflicting laws. So just this past week, I spoke to a delegation from Pakistan that was coming through Microsoft on their way to DC as part of a Department of Commerce trip visiting the US. And it was quite interesting because I showed this slide and framing up the conversation. They're wrestling with the same issues themselves. It's how do we solve this for our country? How do we protect our citizens when it comes to storing content in the cloud? So, you know, they were asking the same questions that I think a number of people have been asking, both in the policy area as well as in the business area. How do we deal with this? So, next slide. So, if there are 3 points, these are kind of my 3 headlines. Like, if there are 3 things that you walk away from this conversation remembering, I think this would be it. So, one is that we have 30-year-old laws that need to be modernized. And as Charles mentioned, and I'll say it again, you know, in my opinion, this is a defining issue, I think, for this future data-centric economy that we're moving towards. And I think the second point is, you know, we need to improve the law for the sake of both privacy and security. So it's not either or. I think it's both. And I'll talk about that a little bit. And then third, and I think this is important as well, is that, you know, people should not have to give up their rights when they go online. And I think right now there is a conversation certainly within the U.S. government as pertains to a Microsoft case that I'll tell you a little bit about. That's really, I think, going to be defining what that means going forward. So, next slide. 1986. Remember 1986? This is what our world looked like in 1986. And this is when a bill or legislation was passed by the Congress called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, or ECPA. So ECPA today governs when people's data must be kept private and when and how law enforcement gets access to it. So again, it was written in 1986 when our first laptop was introduced. Our phones were just catching on. The World Wide Web was still 3 years away from being invented. And certainly when Congress drew up ECPA, they had no way to understand what a global cloud looks like. So this is the world of which our electronic communications privacy laws were drawn up in. Next slide. So this is our world today. So I especially like the refrigerator saying, Dave, you're looking a little pudgy. That could be, you know, our 2001 future. So we're still relying on laws when it comes to privacy and safety from 30 years ago to this world today. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things I just wanted to point out, have folks heard about the fourth industrial revolution? This is something new to me. But the World Economic Forum has, this past January, sort of put this forward. And you know, their premise is that this is something that we're entering now. It's more of this Internet of Things, where you know, you have a cloud-driven economy, and you have data that's getting collected and shared with users in many different ways. So I encourage you to go check it out online. There's a really interesting 14-minute video that sort of talks about this and what this means. But you know, again, we have laws in the U.S. and I would say we also have global laws and legal frameworks in place that are not ready to deal with this current and future that we're looking at right now. And so, you know, we're faced, and I'll say this from a Microsoft standpoint, you know, we're faced with this sort of complex network of laws that we're trying to follow because we want to be compliant as a company with laws. But we have, you know, these laws are coming into conflict. And, you know, from a number of the Microsoft partners who are small businesses, we don't have all the legal resources necessarily that Microsoft has. Same sort of issues they're facing. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do with GFI is communicate this to elected officials about why it's time to update these laws and why this is important. So I want to talk a little bit about a case right now involving Microsoft and the U.S. government. And this is really, I think, an important test case that's going to, I think, have ramifications for what this sort of new global world and laws look like. All right, next slide. It has to do with this. This is a Microsoft data center in Dublin, Ireland. And it has to do with, now this is my build slide, so it has to do with this. A warrant that was issued in December of 2013 by the US government. And this warrant was served to Microsoft seeking access to customer emails that were stored in Dublin, Ireland, in that data center. And the customer in question is an Irish citizen. And the case, and what makes this sort of an interesting test case, is this involves a drug investigation. So involving someone in Dublin, Ireland, who was has a Hotmail account, and the government was seeking access through a warrant sent to Microsoft to get to the citizen's data. And so this is the issue, to kind of frame it up for you. The government argues that emails stored in the cloud cease to belong exclusively to you. Microsoft is arguing that the US government can't force American companies to turn over customer emails in overseas company data centers, especially when they're not citizens. So this is the conflict that's at hand right now. Next slide. So I think, this really kind of sums up, I think, the concern. If the Justice Department gets access to information, what's to stop, say, courts in Brazil or China to ask or order American companies to do the same for citizens here in the U.S.? What does digital sovereignty mean? Is it tied to citizenship, or is it tied to where data is stored? these are questions I think that a number of people are wrestling with right now. And the case itself, I think we'll have some answers, at least from a US perspective on it. So Microsoft's getting a lot of support for our position, which is, again, your emails are your own. Your emails are like paper letters that you store in a desk drawer or in a file cabinet, that the analog world should also apply to the digital world. So it has to do with Fourth Amendment when you're thinking about that. So we have a broad support from a number of companies, a number of leading computer sciences and education institutions, a number of trade associations, and I think importantly the Republic of Ireland as well. So all these stakeholders have filed amicus briefs to our case. So right now our case sits in the second U.S. appeals court in New York. It was argued back in November. We lost the first round. So we're awaiting the results we're waiting for the three judges to make a decision, but we think either way, the U.S. government loses or Microsoft loses, we think it's going to go to the Supreme Court to make a decision on this. So this is an important test case, if you will, for what we're talking about. So we can click through this really quick. So
you hope it goes there when there's 9 justices?
I think so. That would be good.
That would be good.
Because a tie would, send back to appeals. Yeah, that's right. So that's another interesting perspective on with the U.S. elections and who's going to select those judges. Can you go back real quick? So we've conducted some research on this, and again, we can just go through this quickly, but I just wanted to show you, 83% of American voters believe personal information stored in the cloud deserves the same privacy protections as personal information stored on paper. Next slide. 87% of Irish agree. And this, again, similar to what I was talking about, 89% of Irish polled say a foreign government should not be able to demand information stored in Ireland without working with the Irish government. So I think one other thing I wanted to mention with this is that there are treaties in place between the U.S. and a number of countries to be able to access data without a warrant. They're called MLATs, or Mutually Legal Assurance Treaties. And these frameworks exist so that governments, if there are times for national security or for the course of investigations, that government needs access to information stored in the cloud. So there is a process in place to get this information. I would argue too, though, that the MLAT treaties are also very old in some cases, so they need to be updated as well. And so this is kind of what's happening in the digital space, if you will, when it comes to cloud and privacy. A lot of governments are thinking about what do we need to do to update our laws to reflect this new reality. So one of the other things that I think has come out in this case, and it came out when the judges were questioning the U.S. government, is that shouldn't Congress act? Like, doesn't Congress have the authority here to update the law? Shouldn't they be doing this? And I think the consensus is yes. The U.S. government and Microsoft agree that Congress needs to act. And so this is a quote from Brad Smith, who's our president and chief legal officer, who's been obviously heavily involved in this. And I think it was important just to kind of understand this piece of it. But again, the legal rules that were written at the dawn of the personal computing era are no longer adequate with this mobile cloud world that we live in. And so new laws are needed. So next slide. So there is good news. Change could be coming. 419 to 0, that was ECBA reform that just passed the House a few weeks ago. So, and it is is updating to reflect some of the issues that I'm talking about.
You don't even have a protest with it.
Yep, and I thought this was a good quote that really captures sort of what's going on. It's updating, it's modernizing our laws to reflect a digital Fourth Amendment. So applying the technologies of our day to 18th century standard that was articulated by the Constitution, which was that citizens should be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. And that should extend to digital as it does to what we can protect on paper. So this is about US and ECPA. So there's another bill in Congress as well that is not moving at the moment. And it's called the LEADS Act. Law enforcement access to data stored abroad. This has to do with the issues raised in the Microsoft case. So basically, the bill that affirms that customer content stored in the U.S. must be accessed via a search warrant, and you can't use a warrant to collect data overseas. It also talks about updating MLAT treaties. So this has a number of, a decent amount of bipartisan support, not as much as ECPA reform. ECPA reform had over 300 members co-sign onto that bill. The LEADS Act has about 178 in the House. And so we're looking to, work to get more members of Congress informed and educated about why this is important as well. So what we've been hearing is that Senator Orrin Hatch, Senate, he's the co-sponsor, or the chief sponsor, excuse me, of the bill in the Senate, is looking to perhaps amend the bill, change it a bit to reflect some feedback that people have given to him. And one of the issues that he's looking to amend on is about the citizenship issue, whether it's based on your citizenship or where data is stored. And right now the act is written as where data is stored. And I think they're looking to amend it to talk about what country you're a citizen of, and then those laws apply. Because, for example, Google, Amazon, they have a different business model. Google, for example, will take bits of your data when you're storing it in the cloud and put it into data centers all over the world. So, that's feedback that's important. So your data could be in 3 or 4 different countries at a particular time. Whereas Microsoft will put your data all in one data center. So, again, reflecting the realities of this cloud and digital world that we live in. So there's one other piece then I want to talk about, and not to do a sharp turn, but I know we're going to be talking about cybersecurity. And there's another aspect to this that I just want to introduce, and it's something, again, that a number of our Microsoft partners have been talking about, and Microsoft has been talking about as well. So not only do we need to update our outdated laws, but I think we also need to further transform some of our institutions. And what this is showing you is that, in this data-centric world, jobs in cybersecurity, for example, or being able to be not only technology literate, but also understand some of the basics of coding or the basics of computer science education is going to be something that's going to be important in this future economy. And right now, we have a big talent shortage in the U.S. where we're not graduating enough kids who have computer science, for example, as a degree. It's a shortage that Microsoft is facing. It's a shortage that a number of our Microsoft partners are facing as well. They can't find the right talent to hire to meet the demands of customers and what they need to be doing to grow their businesses. And again, it's not just the U.S. that's facing this. This is something that is impacting countries around the world as well. So this is something that Voices for Innovation has been talking about. We're trying to get funding for computer science education to the tune of $250 million in the next appropriations bill. That's going to be hopefully passed this year. It's not a lot of money, but it's a start. Microsoft has a number of programs along with a number of our Computers and a number of other big tech companies to try to promote computer science education. I'm happy to talk about that. But I think, fundamentally, what I've been encouraging our Microsoft partners to talk about with their elected officials is the need and the importance to make investments in whether it's computer science education, technology literacy, infrastructure, because we need to have more teachers who know how to teach computer science, and frankly, we need more capacity for those who want to study computer science. So the University of Washington, for example, even if they wanted to admit everyone who wanted to study computer science, they can't do it right now because they don't have capacity. So there's an investment, and Microsoft's making an investment to try to expand capacity for the University of Washington. So I think, and when I say, are we at our Sputnik moment, because my feeling is that we're just one major cybersecurity breach away from really kind of waking people up to this, waking people up to this particular issue right here. Is that we have 1.5 million people short right now by 2020, just a few years away, for the demand of the jobs that are going to be out there and the demand for cybersecurity. So now,
a small segue.
yeah.
Our host, Candi Merrill with Western Washington University, has been an awesome supporter of what John was talking about. They've helped us with this space, they've helped us with hosting the Core Dojo, and of course, next fall, they're going to be launching their cybersecurity degree program at this facility. So obviously, there are a lot of partners, and our next speaker is also going to be talking to the actual technical merits and what you need to deal with. So I just wanted to take that quick little bit to acknowledge Western Washington University for hosting this event and helping us get everything launched. So thank you.
Yeah, it's important, again, institutions anywhere where we can teach the next generation and make sure that we're providing the skills necessary. So that was my conclusion, and
Do we have a next one? There you go.
just thank you, and that's my contact information. voicesforinnovation.org is our website. I encourage you to check us out, and again, sign up, and love to have a further conversation with you about these topics. So thank you.
Candi, if you want to add any comments right there before I bring up Mike.
Sure. I'm kind of filling in for Dr. Brad Johnson, who was going to present today, but he had an emergency and couldn't get away from Bellingham. So, sorry, I can't do his.
Slide you this way. Slide you
Sorry,
this way.
I can't do his presentation. I'm not sure what it was he was going to talk about, but I have a couple of interesting things I can tag on to what Jonathan said about the need for cybersecurity professionals. As government and commerce is working out the landscape of the cloud and figuring out the policies around that, higher education is just scrambling. And this isn't just local, but it's all over the nation. Just scrambling to figure out how to turn out the professionals of the future and putting together cybersecurity programs. Ours, as Charles mentioned, we are working on the infrastructure of it now and getting this campus ready so that we'll be able to launch our program here in the fall of 2017. We have some students in the pipeline already. Our program is in partnership with Olympic College so that the students will do their first 2 years at Olympic College or Peninsula College and then transfer into Western for their second 2 years. It will all be face-to-face here in Poulsbo. Working with those students now, hiring faculty, so we're doing all of the legwork to get ready to do that. But you know, burning glass technologies, and I'm sorry I didn't bring a copy of this report for everyone, but I can get you a copy of it if you'd like. This came out late in 2015, so it's not too far out of date. They state that jobs in cybersecurity are currently growing 3 times as fast as jobs in any other IT-related field. And the students, or the graduates, are commanding a 9% increase, a 9% higher starting salary in cybersecurity than in any other IT-related field. While the jobs used to be, just a couple of years ago, the only cybersecurity jobs were in government or NGOs, it's now branching out, and the highest growth in those types of jobs is in finance, healthcare, and retail. So I think it's just spreading. The more business that gets carried on in the cloud, the more everyone has their data in the cloud, the more everyone needs to have their data protected. One thing that we're acutely aware of here in Kitsap County, because of our access to the military and the NGOs, is that many of these jobs require a security clearance. And so we're very well aware of that. In this area, probably a greater percentage of those jobs will require a security clearance. And we know that people who are interested in cybersecurity tend to be curious and getting into things. And so we plan to work with them very early on, letting them know what they need to do to protect their ability to get that security clearance. I think that's it.
Awesome.
Sorry,
Candi,
sorry
thanks
I'm
again.
not Brad Johnson. I'm sure he would have done a better job.
That was
No.
pretty
You
good.
got me.
Mr. Hamilton.
Okay.
First off, I want to say thank you, Mike, for coming out. It's been a presenter of ours in the past.
Well, I love doing this.
And you get to talk to people that actually
They're going to
mostly
say
understand
crazy
what you're
things,
talking
and it's
about.
completely okay.
This is Mike Hamilton of Critical Informatics.
Okay, thanks, that was a great presentation.
Don't get too far.
Are we going to engage in
And
some
we're going to
discussion
engage
after?
after your piece, then we'll open up the floor to questions, and then they can float around.
Great, because I have some questions for you. Or some observations, I guess. So my understanding was I needed to have a short talk so that we could then do some Q&A, and since Dr. Johnson isn't here, hi Candi. What I'm going to do is on my slides, I'm going to talk longer than I ordinarily would have talked.
Just so you know, that mark is about where the edge of the
Yes.
camera is.
So I have to be on camera?
Yeah, you can be the disembodied voice and just a hand.
It's, in my business, it's better to be that. Okay, so I actually can go on at some length about lots of different stuff. And so just a little bit about my background. When you were talking about in 1986, when right before the internet started, I was at University of Southern California handing Kevin Mitnick an account to a VAX that he used to get in a lot of trouble. And subsequently worked at the Jet Propulsion Lab. After I left, I broke back in so that I could steal an email and have somebody fired. Worked for organized crime. And now I'm in business.
That's a great fact.
I was, let's
That's
see,
much more interesting.
most recently I was a policy advisor for Washington State government, and I was the CISO for the city of Seattle, which tells you that nobody's background check really works. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to package this really simply because there's so much to this that all the spookery involved kind of clouds what I think are the key issues around this. So when I talk to executives and people that are going to spend money, it's important that we talk about this in the right way, because if you start to talk about SQL injection and cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, and buffer overflow, nobody knows what you're talking about, and nobody cares. But if you convert things to dollars, and you can package it very simply to talk to elected officials, executives in the C-suite, they get that, right? Because then it becomes about risk management, right? What's the appropriate investment for me to make so that I can mitigate a number of dollars of liability that I have measured, right? That's really the conversation that we need to have at a business level. So I like to talk about 3 basic things that go wrong, because the packaging that way, anybody can wrap their head around. So it's unauthorized disclosure of protected records, and that's the thing that's in the news all the time. That sucks all the air out of the room. Oh my God, the dreaded data breach, right? Okay, data breach. By the way, we use the dumbest words for stuff in this business, right? What does cyber mean? What is that? What is it? That word, to my knowledge, was created by an author named William Gibson in Neuromancer, right? Isn't that where that comes from?
Yep.
Why did we co-opt a great book and turn it into a really stupid catch-all word? You know, I think largely it's because the federal government needs like soundbite words.
I think it was Doctor Who, and they wanted to have the Cybermen.
Whatever, nobody has ever known what it is, but it catches all of these complex things. So, unauthorized disclosure is the thing that we hear about in the news all the time. And then there's theft. And theft, we know organized crime is a real bad problem. Organized crime is taking on different forms now. They used to steal your money, now they steal the organizational money, and now they're even stealing money from the entire banking system. All right, what could possibly go wrong next, okay? And then there's disruption. And to me, this is the one that's going to suck all the air out of the room next. Because when you get a letter from your credit card company saying that your card has been disclosed and they're going to monitor your credit, by this time you throw that thing away, right? I mean, no financial harm really comes to the consumer, but if your toilet won't flush for 3 days, that's a disaster, right? And so these are the kind of things, and they're lining up to happen. They're beginning to happen right now. So what I like to do is package things in these ways. And I want to talk about each one of these in succession so that we can drill down a little bit into some of the things that actually go wrong around here. Okay, next slide. Okay, so unauthorized disclosure. There are a bunch of regulatory requirements right now. Some of those are imposed at the state level. And so 47 states have data breach reporting acts. So if you lose records, this started with something called Senate bill, what was the number of the Senate bill in California where there was, I forget, so long ago, but all of the language has been co-opted from the original California Senate bill, and personally identifiable information is a combination of public and non-public elements of information that when in aggregate are disclosed, they can be used to perform financial fraud. Okay, that's what it is. All right, we use the term identity theft. Okay, that's dumb. It's not identity theft, it's fraud. That's what it is. Okay, cardholder data. Cardholder data is regulated, for the most part, by the payment card industry. And they have this big ecosystem. There's issuing, the issuers, Visa, MasterCard, American Express. There are acquiring banks, Bank of America, any bank really. And then there's the merchants. That's who has the point of sale system. That's who has the website for e-commerce and things like this. And so this one is really, the intent is not really to protect cardholder data. The intent is to move liability from the issuers and acquiring banks onto the merchants. That's what PCI is about, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. Personal health information and electronic personal health information are highly regulated by HIPAA, the Health Insurers Portability and Accountability Act. And this one is not messing around. HIPAA, if you have an unauthorized disclosure of health records, not only are you going to have to do the data breach because you just hit the state of Washington, in this example's radar, for losing records, but you're going to get fined big. And so many people are handling health data right now that it's starting to make a whole lot of sense to throw that stuff out of the cloud so that there's one point of administration where they meet regulatory requirements instead of 500 organizations trying to do that independently. It really does make a lot of sense. Personal health information is now a much bigger target than personally identifiable information or even cardholder information. And the reason is because there's such a tremendous glut of cardholder information and stolen credit card information out on the dark web, right? A $20,000 full track credit card with CVV number and all of that stuff costs you about $5 for a $20,000 card. And it's because there's so many of them out there. They can't sell them anymore. Criminal justice information, this is an interesting one too. And I think this is a harbinger of things to come. More and more, there are going to be little carve-outs for certain kinds of data to say you have to have special protection controls around this. So this one's called CJIS, the Criminal Justice Information Standard. And again, you know, there's a certain definition of information, and then there's a whole bunch of rules about who can see it, who can handle it, what kind of background checks they need, what kind of controls have to be in place. So this is all a big ball of records here we don't want to disclose, right? Well, the kind of median accepted value for, remember I said we need to talk in dollars, the median accepted value is somewhere around $200 a record. And it depends on who you believe, the Ponemon Institute or Verizon or whoever's, you know, aggregated, how much did this cost you? 200 is a pretty good, reasonable estimate here. It's going to be lower if you're in the public sector. It's going to be higher in some cases, but think about that. So you have 1,000 records. Your liability is $200,000. It makes sense to spend $10,000 on controls. It does not make sense to spend $200,000 on controls, right? This is the conversation that we need to have. This is the way we need to have the conversation to pull it out of the spookery range. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, theft and extortion, and I put these in the same bucket because they're both about money. So way back in the 20th century, when I was right up on the line of not being a favorite guy at the FBI like I am now, there was viruses, and they would melt networks, right? And I don't know if any of you go back far enough to remember like the Melissa virus and the I love you virus, all that stuff, right? And all that was about, you know, crushing networks. Okay, when you're going to steal money, you got to be quiet. So they got real quiet, and they started to do things like surveil your keystrokes so that when you logged into bankofamerica.com, they had your password, right? They got kind of stealthy. And now they're getting really stealthy, and they're going for bigger pots of money. So wire transfer fraud, okay, I don't know if this is a familiar thing to anybody, but this has actually happened a number of times in our region, and it's getting pretty well epidemic. So wire transfer fraud can happen in a number of ways. I can put some malware on the system that does wire transfers, ACH, automated clearinghouse transfers, right? Bank to bank kind of stuff. And I can take the system over and I can just wire money. I can, and this has occurred in our region, I can add users to the payroll database or change bank routing numbers in the payroll database, so I just get paid on payday like any other person, you know, until somebody raises their hand and said I can get paid, they figure that out. And this has happened. In fact, our friend in Kansas told me about this. Now, what's happening, and this is happening quite a bit lately, in fact, they've given it a name, it's CEO impersonation fraud. The person that handles wire transfers on behalf of a company or political jurisdiction or whatever will get a piece of email from the CEO saying, okay, I need you to conduct this transfer right away. This is a confidential project going on. Here are the details. And they will happily wire money away. And this has happened, the biggest one I know about is $17 million. They asked me to make a payment on shipbuilding materials. I said, okay, they did it, 17 million bucks. Bye. That one's kind of hurt. Okay, intellectual property and company data. Who's heard the story of the plane on the Chinese tarmac that looks just like an F-35?
Yeah.
You know why? It basically is an F-35, all right? So we have had a whole lot of bleed off of our intellectual property, and it's not just from the federal government and defense contractors. It's now company versus company is starting to emerge, and you can steal your competitors' secrets. And so this has been extremely interesting. One case that's in the news right now, there's a person that just got prosecuted, I think just got sentenced, and it was one of this crew of people that was stealing press releases from companies before they came out and turning those over to traders so that they could trade based on those. And they made millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so that's not really insider trading. And I mean, to your point, some of your points, we just don't have laws that handle those kinds of things. You know, and it's unfortunate, I think, that the federal government in particular, we don't have any lawmakers that know anything about technology. I think there's 3 people in Congress that actually have a tech background. That's crazy. The future of the United States is young, brown, female, and tech. That's what it is. So, and I'm really hoping it works out that way. I feel a lot better. Warren Hatch does not give me any comments.
Yeah.
Okay. So intellectual property companies.
I know, he's
He's a good guy, I know.
he's leading a number of these tech bills, like Defend Trade
I know.
Secrets Act, like that was.
He has,
a bill
and
that
he
just
is-
passed, to your point.
Yeah, well,
I know.
more of the guys that
I
bring
know what you're
snowballs
saying.
into the Senate, those guys.
I know what you're saying.
Okay.
I know what you're saying.
Okay, point of sale systems, all right? So again, the evolution of theft has occurred, and now malware is not interested so much in taking over your desktop computer if they want to steal big amounts of money. There's now POS-specific malware that goes in, and this is what happened at Target, right? And interestingly, and I'll get back to Target in a minute, but it all had to do with an HVAC vendor. And so that's actually a problem, HVAC being a control system that handles, right, air conditioning and heating and things like that. So point of sale systems are really under attack right now. ATM malware. Do you guys see the story that came out 2 days ago about new and improved ATM malware? Right? The technique is called jackpotting, for good reasons. Pioneered by a guy named Barnaby Jack, who worked for a Seattle company called IOActive. And you can put malware on an ATM system and do all kinds of creative things with it. The one you want is to get it spit out lots of money, and that's exactly what they do. So ATM malware. Now the SWIFT system. And what's the acronym for SWIFT? Okay, it's the global. Yeah, it's the global financial transaction system. It's when you're going to do like country-to-country transfers. In Bangladesh, 81 million bucks. 81 million bucks. That'll get your attention. And they're finding out that how other banks have implemented the SWIFT system is so dependent on keeping that software up to date. A lot of them haven't done it, and they are these entry points into this system that controls our global finances. Right? So we're not about viruses melting networks anymore. It's about the entire global financial system. Have a nice day. Okay, so again, going back to dollars.
Well, they developed all of these lesser skills by getting into our computers and trying to steal our money. But they've learned how to do this on a global scale now.
Well, it's they've turned into a gigantic business with coding contests and bonuses paid and conferences, and this is not, we're not dealing with like dudes anymore.
Yeah.
All right, these are businesses. All right, so in terms of how we communicate what the liability potentially is around a wire transfer system, all right, I got a range here, $50,000 to $10 million. Okay, a jurisdiction north of here that shall remain nameless wired away $450,000. Okay, that was a city in the state of Washington. A hospital over kind of mid-state, $1.2 million. All right, in our neighborhood this is happening, and I will tell you that 2 assisted living facilities in Bremerton had this happen to them. How do I know this? Because everybody tells me everything. But so clearly it's going up in time, right? So if we're going to have this conversation, what's the liability around this? What's the appropriate investment to make in controls, right? And investing in controls is only one way to manage risk, right? You can avoid risk, completely get rid of the situation that caused the risk. We don't do wire transfers from here anymore, okay? For example, you can accept risk, right? That's the 1979 Ford Pinto method of risk management. We know they blow up. It's cheaper for us to pay people off.
Just don't hit them in the back.
Right. You can mitigate risk through controls, and again, that's the thing about the appropriate investment. Or you can transfer risk through insurance, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, thanks. Okay, all right, now, here's the top of the food chain right here. All right, if Citizen Z loses his or her credit card, that's a bummer, all right? But if you call 911 and it doesn't work, that's a disaster, all right? And that's a big, big difference. And I will tell you that a lot of critical infrastructure, I know this is hard to read, but critical infrastructure started out as 19 sectors designated by the Department of Homeland Security as critical to the United States, the disruption of which would end up in great financial, social, etc. harm to the country, all right? Dams, water, energy, finance, all right? As I say these things, think to yourself this, DHS thinks this is a big private sector problem. They think that this is the communication sector, that's AT&T, all right? You need to think your communication sector, the one that applies to you, that's 911. That's the radio systems run by law enforcement and public safety to make sure your house doesn't burn down because they get there in time. All right? This local scale critical infrastructure, to me, is a lot more important than AT&T. AT&T has every driver in the world to do the right thing so that their infrastructure doesn't fail, not the least of which is shareholder pressure. Right? When we're talking about local government, state government, they manage by landmine for the most part. Ours doesn't here, and I know that because I talk to them all the time, but for the most part, they don't solve a problem that hasn't blown up into a big problem. So when you talk about blowing up a big problem with infrastructure and a disruption right here, somebody, you know, the potential is loss of life. So, everybody knows what DDoS is, right? Distributed denial of service. We hurl packets and things to make them not work anymore. Is anybody familiar with TDOS? Telephony denial of service. So it turns out that when you use VoIP, the Voice over Internet Protocol, it's pretty easy to fake the caller ID field. Okay? So I can call a 911 center, and I can make it look like it came from Bud's house. And I can say, home invasion robbery, send SWAT. And SWAT comes over to Bud's house at 3 o'clock in the morning. Don't walk out with a shotgun when that happens, I'm just saying. This happens at least once a week in the United States. Okay? That's called swatting, and it's, wow, really irritating. The other thing that happens is flooding call centers with fake calls. If 911 doesn't know what's real and what's not, somebody is likely to die, all right? Now, you know, cybersecurity starts to be more of a life safety issue, doesn't it? And I know that federal government is working on this through a place called the NCIC, the National Cybersecurity Communications and Integration Center. And they send call center analytics up from 911 centers and from hospital call centers and things like that to keep an eye on stuff like this. But it happens. So that's disruption of a critical service. These critical infrastructure services. Think about the craziness that goes on in Seattle on May 1st. And I'm well aware of that because when I was the Chief of Information Security for the City of Seattle, every May 1st we would activate the EOC. I would have to go down there, ESF2, communications support, blah, blah, blah. Every time there was that much snow, I was in the EOC. Seattle gets paralyzed fairly easily. But I am really surprised that during a May Day protest, when people start throwing stuff, it's not accompanied by knocking down traffic management. It turns out to be super easy to make all the lights in the city blink red. It's really not hard at all, and I know because we've done some very detailed assessments of some traffic management systems. So critical infrastructure, things that are there for you for life safety, quality of life, life support, things like that are extremely important. Piece of that would be control systems. Okay, so there's a place in Seattle where, metaphorically, a person can twist a knob and a dam will open up in Idaho. What could possibly go wrong? Right? And that technology was laid in the 70s. Okay? Well, control systems don't have to be opening and closing dams. They can be injecting chlorine into drinking water to purify it. Waste treatment systems. HVAC is a control system. This was Cook County, Illinois, about a month ago. It was a water purification plant, and somebody got a hold of this place, and they were able to mess with the chemical mixtures going into the water. They had to shut down the plant for a while, boot the bad guys out. All this stuff is totally possible. Again, if there isn't a reason to fix something, especially the public sector will not fix it. So we're talking about water purification, waste treatment, traffic management, radio systems for law enforcement, and on and on and on. HVAC, I have personally seen compromised a number of times in this state. And in 2 instances, there were HVAC systems that were in data centers. And so if you shut down HVAC in a data center, you have about 7 minutes to live, and then everything is gone. Everything is gone. So that's scary. The other story I'll tell you is HVAC system, also in the exact same jurisdiction here, where the IT manager got a brand new CD from the manufacturer of the HVAC system for their controller. installed this stuff, and it immediately started to send spam. And it sent spam out as if it came from yahoo.tw, the Taiwanese Yahoo. Okay? So first of all, who do you think did that? Yeah. Right? And so it wasn't just this HVAC system, it was systems all over the world, all of a sudden sending spam saying, we're from Taiwan, we're spammers, and of course, the global email system blacklisted Taiwan, okay? It's a very effective attack. But the take-home message here is, the CD from the manufacturer came preloaded with malware, shoved it in there, went out to its command and control, got its instructions, today you will be a spammer, and went to work, okay? That stuff really happens. That's infrastructure, that's our infrastructure. That HVAC was in a data center. Okay, company operations, this is starting to happen with alarming frequency now. Company operations are being disrupted through denial of service attacks for the most part, but there's also our favorite ransomware is really disrupting critical operations. And I should have actually talked more about that when we were talking about theft and extortion, because that's a real trend right now. And there's not a whole lot you can do about that except have great backups handy. There are also some group policy objects that you can put in place to, for example, prohibit the execution of any download executables from the download directory. You cannot execute things, right? Some of that stuff needs to be put in place, but DDoS and ransomware are affecting company operations a lot. So, okay, what are the ramifications from this, and how do you turn that into money, right? Well, so the easy way is cost of emergency response. We lost a water utility. We're pretty sure we're going to have to truck in water, we're going to have to activate the DOC, National Guard, maybe they're, we can capture those costs, right? Loss of life, what's a human life worth? I mean, it's really hard to put a number on that, right? So we start getting up into the upper bounds of what this cyber stuff can do in terms of impact, and it becomes a little more difficult to parameterize. So,
Especially if they crash the car you're driving.
Yeah, let's not even get into that, because my money's on self-driving cars, and like I just want the like Uber app and the Google car to show up, just take me where I'm going. I want that, mostly because I have an 11-year-old daughter and I don't want her driving. Okay, all right. So when we're talking about risk, and we've turned this into dollars, the thing we have to do is talk about, well, what's an appropriate investment to make? Where do we want to set the risk bar? And the way to think about that is there's a number of actors here that have varying capabilities and varying motivations, okay? Hacktivists are not going to steal your money. Nation states are probably not going to steal your money. Organized crime, they want your money. Other companies, they want your secrets, right? So we can have this taxonomy of actors here. You can talk about which ones we can more than likely keep out with a certain number of controls, right? Again, you know, if your risk bar is right here, Darwin is probably going to end up being right, and you will not be around long, for real. If we want to talk about theft, we want to talk about how to mitigate, you know, things like ransomware, wire transfer fraud, things like that. You're going to need to put some money in controls. Remember, it's accept, avoid, mitigate through controls, or transfer through insurance. You will never get the risk bar all the way to the top. It's impossible. There is no perfect security. Security is not a destination, it's continuous improvement. You will never get the risk bar all the way to the top. If a country wants to blast you off the network bad enough, they will do it. So you have to say, well, what's appropriate for us, and then what's left? That residual risk, let's transfer that with insurance, right? So, and this is becoming a very, very popular thing now, is risk transference through insurance, cyber risk transference through insurance. I could go on at some length about how this is so bubbly and frothy and not well understood and not well executed right now, right? Remember I said all those things that can go wrong? The only thing they care about is the records, because they can wrap their head around $200 a record, and that's all. So I'm going to a very interesting insurance, with a bunch of insurance brokers on September 21st, and I'm going to let them have it. So, mitigating and then transferring through insurance. But, next slide please, insurance companies won't insure stupid. So if you have not spent any time at all putting anything into controls, understanding where your exposures are, et cetera, and you try to insure your risk, they will deny your claim. In fact, you might not be insurable at all. So for a while, this was going to be looked at as somewhat of a panacea, right? We don't, because we can't hire people, to your point about there just are no practitioners available, and especially there's a lot of infrastructure providers that are super, super critical that are frozen out of that market and can't hire anybody. They go, we'll just insure this stuff. Well, no, you can't do that, because insurance companies are fighting back on this and say you didn't even meet basic standards, and in some cases, they won't even say what those standards are. They say you didn't do what we think might have been right if we had given you guidance on this, so we're not going to honor your claim. And all this stuff is in court right now. So, this is what I'm going to leave you with right here. All right? There's basically 3 things that can go wrong. We can kind of talk about how much each one of those things are worth, and then the conversation as to what's an appropriate investment to avoid, accept, mitigate, or transfer that risk. And you got to do the first 3 things before you try the last one, otherwise they won't honor your claim. So thank you very much. That's really
Okay, so now we get to our panel portion. I know you guys have you're all filled up with questions. So who wants to start off with some questions for either Jonathan?
I want to start out with a question for Jonathan.
Okay.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
You go first.
Okay, so largely when you talked about moving the needle politically with legislation,
Yeah.
for the most part you talk about federal government. And there is a big difference between state and local government and federal government. And I'm going to give you an example. The point I'm going to try and make is that technology leads policy by a lot. And I don't think it's really going to be able to go the other way. And so this is a condition we're just going to have to live with. But in the day where we're having the conversation between privacy and security, I don't want stuff to blow up. I like it when they say, hey, we caught these guys and they were plotting to do this thing. I think they found that out, right? They had to surveil to do that.
Right.
However, if they had a warrant to do that, I think that's great, right? If it's not an unreasonable search and seizure, that's great.
Yeah.
However, law enforcement, especially at the local level, lives on grant money. And when you commoditize surveillance gear, and if I say Stingray, you know what I'm talking about, dirt boxes, Stingrays, right? These are cell tower simulators that hoover up all the phone stuff, right? And so they're looking for one, they're hoovering up everybody. And if they see something, that may lead them in a direction they didn't think they were going, well, that's just fine.
Yeah.
So local law enforcement goes to these conferences where we have commoditized surveillance gear, have never put policy around this.
Right.
They buy this stuff with grant money and implement it, and city council, county commissioners don't even know this until we hit the landmine like they did in Tacoma, and they go, you're doing what? And then we end up with policy around it. So.
Right.
My question is there any possibility, given the activities that you're involved in, that we can create legislation at the federal level that will affect things like that at state and local level? Or is that out of bounds for federal legislation?
So it's an interesting question. So there, and I would say there's also an interesting left-right dynamic happening right now around this with privacy.
Yeah.
So you have, on the one hand, you have the ACLU. So when you mentioned like the Stingrays, like they are looking at some state
They hate that stuff, yeah.
right? And then, I just stumbled across this, but there's a right of center group, the 10th Amendment. I can't remember their full name, but they're a nonprofit that's all about states' rights that are also opposed to the Stingrays. Again, around government collecting information, not trusting government. So I think that I think one thing that's important is to start having these conversations, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level. I think that's something that's critically important. I think the second thing is as we think about sort of modernizing our laws, I think that you can think about it federally, but also you need to think about it also at the state and local level as well. Sort of what do we want our law enforcement to be able to do to protect us? How do we balance that? How do we have that conversation? And so, there have been some efforts to take the ECPO reform and push it down to the state level to sort of, since Congress doesn't act, even though amazingly it acted with
And unanimously.
and
Who saw that
unanimously,
coming?
which was amazing as well.
Especially for the House.
Yeah, especially for the House, but there is, I think, some understanding among our, elected officials that more needs to be done to modernize this, but I think, furthering that conversation is important. So, to answer your question, I feel like that it has to kind of happen at 3 levels, right? At the federal level, there could be some things that you could do to set sort of that national policy, but then when it comes to, state and local, where the implementation happens, there has to be some policies set there as well. That's just, that's my thinking around it, at least. And I think, the other thing that we talk about with BFI is it's important for people to be, who understand this, to be having conversations and educating their elected officials about it. So even if there's not a particular piece of legislation or something that you want to advocate for, just having a conversation about this, about what you just shared, I think is critical. Because you're right, elected officials have a lot coming at them from many different constituencies. And one thing I found is that they don't hear enough from our industry, from people within our industry. So I think, it's important to just, raise these issues with them, in my opinion.
I had an interesting conversation with Derek Kilmer's got a staffer that's a CIA fellow. Clayton Swope is definitely the smartest guy in the room that I've ever seen. And he sent me a piece of legislation where somebody was carving out grant funding specifically for local law enforcement, specifically to buy cybersecurity products, right? Cybersecurity, surveillance, I mean, it's a big gray zone there, and he asked, hey, is this a good idea? Should I get the congressman to co-sponsor this? And I said, you should run away from this as fast as you can. Yeah, for the reason I mentioned.
Right, and it's, I think, again, at the federal level, it's oftentimes too big, right? So there are those in Congress who want to block grant everything and not put a lot of strings on it, as you're saying, so create that gray area. And then there are others, who do want to put a lot more sort of parameters around it. But I really think, it bubbles up from local to state to federal. That's at least how I would think, especially in the case that you mentioned.
Okay, what's your question for me?
So I have a question for you. So what I've been reading about is sort of this next wave of concern, and you touched upon it a little bit, but not so much the theft piece, but actually changing people's data. Right?
Oh yeah, the integrity of data.
Integrity, like going in and be able to, for example, change people's credit scores.
Sure.
Because as I sort of my premise is, I talked about this data-centric future. Data's going to define us, right? So define us in cyberspace, define us in physical space, and it's amorphous. As currency becomes like Bitcoin, right, becomes more data-driven, right? Mm-hmm. So being able to go in there and manipulate data, change things about people, health records, for example. So I'm just curious if people are thinking about that, or I don't even know how you, communicate about insurance, how you put a cost even around that.
Yeah.
But that's the thing that really, when I look in, and it scares me, like that's something that really worries me.
I agree, and so that's a great topic to hit on, and I didn't say anything about that, but it's actually happened, well, it's not happened here. Things like clinical testing results, I mean, things like that, really, you could kill a lot of people by changing clinical testing results and having that made into a drug that then gets given to people and kills them. That's an extreme example, but here in the state of Washington, about maybe more than 2 years ago, there was, they said, we have a data breach. And it turned out to be a database of DUI defendants. And their driver's license information was lifted along with some other things. And what they popped to is they said, well, we lost 2 Social Security numbers. Okay, but that's not the point. The point is, these were people who were in the justice system for DUI. And if I'm a defense attorney, I'm saying you admitted that this database was potentially stolen, at least pieces of it were stolen. That means there was unauthorized access to this database. And if people can steal stuff, they can change stuff. The integrity of data is now in question, my client gets off. And I think that other shoe is still going to drop. I actually do. So yeah, this has actually started to come up in the news more and more, how and this is being talked about at the federal level, how this could be a much bigger issue than this pathetic unauthorized disclosure thing that we choose to get so wrapped around the axle about. When you're talking about the integrity of data no longer having a high fidelity, your company can't function. You can't bring products to market. You can't do anything.
Right.
So yeah, this is going to get to be a bigger thing. And where we're going with nation states now becoming extremely emboldened with things like this, and you know, it's not necessarily a military thing, it's an economic thing, right? They know if they crush our economy, they got us. There's all kinds of citizen dissatisfaction with the government, and that ends up in revolution. And I can think of a whole bunch of countries that would like to see that happen here.
Yeah.
So the pinpricks on the economy are the way to do that, and this would be an easy way to do it.
Yeah.
And in fact, another example of that is one that I like to use is Antwerp, Belgium. Port in Antwerp, Belgium had its, the manifests of what was in what cargo container changed because one had a ton of heroin and one had a ton of cocaine in it. And it's so that the bad guys could get in with the trucks and offload those things before anybody knew what was going on. So they demonstrated this can happen. Well, if this happened at one of the port operations on the West Coast, right, the combined Seattle-Tacoma or LA-Long Beach, and disrupted that operation, you saw the impact to the economy when we had the longshore slowdown at our ports. That went all the way across the country. You shut down those two ports, there's $1 trillion at stake there. So, yeah, this is a big deal.
You've just given a really good example of something bad that could happen. Shouldn't the feds, shouldn't the cops, shouldn't the whatever be able to, at some point, get into that data and figure out what happened and put the bad guys away?
Well, they did.
Or
Well,
what I thought I heard earlier was that we have big companies, we certainly have Apple doing it, saying, no, data is sacred. You governments can't touch data. Data
That's
is,
actually not what they're saying.
Yeah.
That's not what they're saying?
No.
It's the news media that's saying it.
No, you might want to explain the difference between a subpoena and a warrant.
Yeah.
Subpoena is like a legal request to access data, but there's no real oversight of that mechanism. If it looks like it's compliant with the law and it's a subpoena, a judge never reviews it to see, do we really need to look at you? Is there a justification for this? That's a subpoena. A warrant is a judge looks at it and says, yes, Ken, we're worried about you.
Okay.
Yeah, like
Of course, now, if the hackers change your records and say you got 6 DUIs and you get pulled over, wait, I don't even drink. Well, how'd that happen?
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Gotcha.
Right. So, and then you have your Fourth Amendment, you know, protections against.
I made a note
right,
to read
yeah.
that.
Yeah. There you go.
Jeff.
So in the perfect world, what should the federal government be doing? Because we know that the 30-year-old laws don't work, and there's no reason to think that the next update will be quicker than 30 years.
Yeah.
The punitive things are kind of easy because everybody gets a knee-jerk reaction and we're going to go punish those evil people.
Right.
But what do we do with policy and things? I just don't see the federal government ever being able to keep up.
Yeah, no,
They can't pass a budget.
Well, so it's interesting because, you know, I had another slide that I've shown, but, you know, the government and policy, as you noted, has always lagged behind technology change. If you go back to the envelope, to the telegraph, right? So it used to be, back in the day, you'd have telegraph operators that would transmit information, but that would be, you know, potentially private information between two parties, so those telegraph operators could be breaking the law if they shared that information. But it took our laws some time to catch up to that. So I do think, yeah, the laws do need to catch up. I think that, and this is starting to happen as well, there needs to be more of a global conversation as well amongst the countries about how you deal with these situations and creating and updating a legal framework. Because again, as I noted, data could be anywhere in the world at any time. And so, sovereignty and how you deal with sovereignty around those issues, I think those are conversations that need to happen. They're starting to happen. As the UN, I think last week, just held a session about how you deal with terrorism in this sort of digital, in this more digital and global economy and communications framework that a number of them are leveraging, and countries, aren't sure how to deal with that. So, I also think that we need to be having conversations with the elected officials as well, because they don't necessarily understand their in some cases it's not even on their radar screen. So I think we need to give them sort of our points of view as well on that. So
yeah, the things that are coming that if we fail to put policy around them in time, have the potential of being a whole lot worse than just encryption that we use to hide illegal stuff.
yeah.
So I for one don't want artificial intelligence going nuts. There are things coming like with respect to the encryption issue and being able to hide my bad guy communications. Quantum computing is coming. Quantum computing laughs at encryption. You can search the entire key space in much less time than we're faced with today, which kind of nullifies that whole argument. So then it becomes the controls on privacy along with good statutory underpinnings for what it requires to convince a judge to go ahead and pull the trigger on busting all your encryption. In the meantime, we're all going to get good at encryption. There's services coming out that are very commoditized and easy to use. Proton Mail being one. I'm a Proton. Anybody else a Proton Mail user? End-to-end encryption. What's the Snapchat just went end-to-end encryption, right? So all these commoditized services. WhatsApp, that's it. Snapchat, I don't even know what Snapchat is.
My kids do.
Right, all the kids do.
Pictures.
I read about it.
Yeah, you don't want it.
No.
Bad pictures.
Right, but so
Sometimes.
the technology changes that are coming are going to be much more impactful on this whole conversation once we get there. And if we fail to put policy around that a priori, it's going to end up being a self-inflicted wound.
Yeah.
I think between here and there, the citizenry are going to educate themselves much more, and you're going to get good with public-private key pairs, and you're going to understand those things a lot better. Or they're going to be so commoditized that you don't need to know anything.
One other thing I wanted
That's
to
a
add.
good,
Oh,
that's a
sorry.
good point I wanted to add, is about what the roles people can play in supporting these folks.
Well, one other thing I wanted to add, and I just wanted to make sure that this is clear too, is that there is this balance between privacy and security. I mean, the U.S. has always wrestled with this going back to the Revolutionary War. I mean,
That would never go away.
and never goes away, right? But I think it's also important that law enforcement has a roadmap to deal with these issues. And so right now, part of the problem is that law enforcement is relying on these outdated laws to deal with some of the cyber threats and some of these issues that are happening today. And so by updating these laws, it gives sort of that roadmap, if you will, to to our law enforcement authorities about how they need to conduct themselves.
Tony and then John.
I was just gonna say that when I, talk with Jonathan and others in our advisory task force about this, I mean, the cybersecurity piece is there too, but there's a huge economic impact here as well. So you think about it and you say, well, all of a sudden, we're no longer trusted by other countries. And so now they start building out their own cyber, cloud networks. And so a lot of our large IT companies can't do business there anymore because we're not trusted. And some of our small and medium businesses too. And then the trickle down effect from that is, okay, so now you're impacting Google and Facebook and Amazon and Microsoft and all of these companies that are operating globally. And so you start talking about the Microsoft partners or any type of small and medium businesses that are using those services, that are selling them to their clients, and then they impact those businesses. Then you take that trickle down effect even further, and now all of our users, everybody that's using cloud services, those are potential impacts that we could have from a government that has overreach, that does not respect the laws as they've evolved. So it's interesting to me when I talk to people about it, the answer I get is, okay, I'll put you in touch with my IT guy. I'm like, it's not about your IT
Yeah.
guy. You know, it's about your kid at school, it's about what we're using at home, it's about everybody. This impacts all of us, and so we all have a vested interest in making sure that our elected officials understand that impact, and that we're all talking to them to educate them so they can make the effective decision and policy decision. So that's kind of the comment I'm going to make.
I think our lawmakers know that the NSA blew up Safe Harbor, right? Right, the privacy agreement that we have with the European
Yeah,
Union?
safe harbor is up, right. So there might be, you know, there are some conversations taking place about having these unilateral agreements, like, for example, between the US and UK
Right.
about data. So again, that creates some more of these piecemeal around the world, but, you know, for a global digital economy, you need to be able to, you know, let data flows happen and be able to also sell services around the world.
And there's the two sides, the ECPA and the leads.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of getting at that. We want to have data privacy for ourselves with ECPA. But leads is the other side of it. It's basically saying, let's lead internationally on this issue as well,
That's right.
instead of waiting for others to write the legislation
That's
for
right.
us.
Let me preface my legislative question just a bit. Everything we just saw and heard is going to be ancient history in 10 years. You can't keep up with technology.
Only 2 years.
Okay, so we start with rocks and sticks and end up with nukes and stuff, and you can't keep up with that. So transferring that to legislation and the basis of it, if you are revealing information from a letter in 1700s or a telegraph in the 1800s or an email in the 2000s, it's the same thing. So my question is, from a legislative viewpoint, we can either complicate by making more regulations and more laws and more complication that only the people who wrote it knows what it says, or we can go back to the beginning. If you're a bad guy, you're a bad guy. The technology you use is irrelevant. So therefore, can we back up and say, okay, let's clear the table, stop the confusion. We can't look forward 15 years to the technology, so the legislation needs to be based upon the act and the intent and this kind of thing rather than how you're doing it today. Do you have any thoughts that way on how things could be couched in those terms? Because the average person, after about 3 minutes of this, will glaze over, we get nowhere, and nobody knows what it means anyway. So can we take it back to bad is bad, good is good, and how would we framework this? Because my concept when I was in high school was we have things like amendments, we have laws and structures that we have, and they apply whether it's rocks and sticks or nuclear warheads. So give me some feedback.
I want to give you a counterexample.
Okay.
And why we need to actively work on updating things. So in the federal government, they have, the level is called FOIA, right? Freedom of Information Act. Generally in the states, they're called Public Disclosure, Public Records Act, Sunshine Laws, things like that.
Right.
Okay, so true story, okay? All that stuff was written for paper records.
Right.
And so there's this whole process you go through where you make a public disclosure request. Within 5 days, they have to respond, tell you when they will provide records that are responsive to your request. Okay, I want all Seattle's police body cam data forever, starting now. Do you know what that costs to provide that? It's impossible, it can't be done. So we need to do something so that our laws are consistent with the different kind of information and the volume of information that we have. It's impossible to apply the law the way it's written to things like that. And so, in fact, this story, a lot of people know this story, that guy that requested all the body cam data, Seattle Police Department, you know how they solved that problem? They hired him. They said, okay, we want you to write software that will help us auto-redact all this data. Okay? Okay, well this dude was not really able to integrate into the culture of law enforcement, shall we say? And one thing led to another, and they walked him out. And the very next day, you know what he did? I want every record from every city in King County, all of it. Okay, that's millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars of work, and it's well within the way the law is written. We've got to change the law.
Right, but I guess part of my point being, do we change the law back to more generic so it covers more and into the future? Or do we just try to put out all the fires as they happen?
Okay, let me take and again, our general.
And now the well-informed response.
Well, I would say I'm going to tap into our president, Brad Smith, and our chief legal officer, who's spoken about this. And I'm not going to speak as eloquently, but I'll give you a thought that I've heard on this, and that is, I think it goes back to sort of going back to our founding principles, right? So what's the principles? What is the policy that you're trying to uphold? And so when we talk about sort of the Fourth Amendment, right, this is a founding principle of our country. This is something that we think is important. So how do you take that and apply it to today, right? And I think that when you think about it in some of those contexts, then it's easier to talk about, okay, well, just because something's, was on paper, 20 years ago, and now that paper is stored digitally in the cloud, just because it's digital shouldn't change sort of the principles around what we hold as citizens of this country. And so I think that's a way to, at least I think, start framing and start talking about this. So.
Thank you.
Put another way, policy isn't so much about the specific technology, but addressing the larger issue. Quantity of data has changed since you've gone from paper to video to electronic records, but you still, the human element, that's the warrant, that's the judge. He doesn't know technology, but he knows why they might want to be looking at you or whether it's a reasonable request.
Right.
He doesn't care if it's encoded video or encrypted or what's, but the laws were written at a time when it was paper records. So it actually says, please produce these documents. And then it was at the beginning of the digital age when records left on a server in the cloud were considered abandoned if they were left there for more than 90 days. That's the law. That's the actual law. And it's like, well, that's not relevant anymore. So we're updating it, but just because we're updating it doesn't mean that 5 years from now it's going to be completely gone. We might have to update it again when we all start wearing personal digital recorders recording our entire life.
Right.
Okay, that's a different level of data, a different level of concern, and you can see where that would be another level. But somebody comes up with a new video recording system, it's not going to, the same laws would apply. But you can see where there will be evolution in this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a conversation about your right to privacy in a public space if you're being recorded.
Or what if it's, I want to access your own personal life stream data to see if you ever committed a crime. Well, is that self-incrimination or not? I'm sure that'll be a case one day.
Right, yeah, and some of this, I should say, aside from legislatively, I think that's another important point. The courts are sort of, dealing with this as well, so there's precedent that can be set, too, that I think is important part of it.
There's I like where he's headed. There's in a perfect world, it could keep it simple, okay?
Mm-hmm.
However, our legal system for 300 years is always looking for the nooks and crannies, and if there isn't very specific detail as to what applies or what doesn't apply, then whenever you're especially trying to use cyber or whatever to chase down the bad guys, they get off because they find this little nook and cranny because it didn't specifically state this, therefore I'm not guilty. So, and I guess my point is, in order to evolve what we're talking about in cyber, I think there's a huge legal piece, and above and beyond what we're talking about, getting legislation to change, to get current with technology, the legal system has to get current with how to live in this new world and not let some of these little off-the-wall court cases or decisions or lack of that specificity become a deciding court case that changes the view of the world for the next 30 years. I mean, just look at last summer, we had this little text thing come up and how everybody's got to jump through their rear ends to figure out how to capture all text.
I want to take this opportunity to mention, thank you for being in the room. Because, tech stuff, sometimes people tend to isolate it and say, well, that's just for the geeks or very select few. Hey, this is an issue, I'll send my IT guy. But the reality is this stuff is bleeding over into everything. And there's a perception that we have to change. That these issues that are in cybersecurity and digital rights and privacy are the purview of just the technologists. They're not. They're really about government and governance and everybody, every citizen in the republic. And the question becomes is, why can't we get more people involved? I think part of it is they're afraid of it. They don't understand it. It's too complicated. So the question then becomes, how do we, and that's where I have to empower you as people that are part of our association or people that know about this kind of content, to speak on these issues with others. Because they're going to be inclined to say, oh God, that's about hacking. I'm going to talk to Mike, but I'm not going to deal with it. Oh, I'm sorry, Mike just tells you what to do, but it's up to your company to take his advice, or your organization, or your government, and act on that. And the same thing comes with policy and laws. Jonathan's been bringing us out to Washington, but that works because they look at him and they say, oh, you're Microsoft, you just want to do this. And we're saying it's not just Microsoft, it's all of us. He brings out small business people as part of VFI because when you go to your congressman or your senator, they realize they're talking to mom and pop, and that's the entire electorate. That's not just one company, that's everybody. And if it's important to everybody, then they listen. And it's really important if they see our daughter there talking about programming, they go, oh,
Yes.
oh, well, that's the youth. I mean,
Yes.
you got to do this.
I forgot to mention, Charles was with us on that trip, and the Keating's lovely
We were
daughter.
inside.
Yes, you were, so it was great having you there. And so that, you know, I would love to get more people involved, you know, just talking about these issues, whether you're within technology or not. I think it's important, and that's part of that's part of our mission with Voices for Innovation, is to make this easy, digestible for people who I know are busy, heads down, running their businesses, doing what they're doing. So I encourage you just to look at our site and sign up and participate.
Awesome. Okay, we got a couple more questions. We got about 3 minutes. Quickly, go ahead. Joe?
I have a seed corn question. You talked about getting more money from the federal government to get people into technology courses, and you're putting together the cyber course. Where the hell are you going to get the people? We're not doing the right things at third grade to get people interested in this, particularly women who drop out of the technology track at 13. Where are we going to get them? What do we need to change?
So we're focusing, so this computer science education initiative is focused on K through 12. So again, you know, but as you think about it, it's going to take time to make that shift happen, right? Because you got to start, you know, finding the teachers that are comfortable, able to teach this, start encouraging kids, and I agree with you, especially women and you know, minorities as well, because I think we need everyone, you know, pursuing this. So it's encouraging them to pursue these tracks. I think some of it is even integrating it more and further into other subjects in the classroom. So I know at my kids' school that's starting to happen a little bit, but I agree it can't be sort of like, hey, that's the STEM program, right? And we're going to send, you know, the quote-unquote computer geeks into the STEM program. I think it's for everybody, and at least that's the message that I try to tell my kids and, you know, tell their friends as well. It's don't just be a data user. You know, you got to know and understand how this stuff works as well.
Since we launched the Coder Dojo, we've had 1,500 for our program in just 1 year. That's probably more people than we've had at most of our meetings. Just these are coming on Saturdays for 2 hours, caring for their kids in the program. We were recently approved by Ireland to be a Coder Dojo regional license group. So we are here to help sponsor and grow these initiatives. The kids, once you expose them to this stuff, they learn on their own. And then you're just there to help guide the process. So we want to see a lot more of that. We have 2 more questions. Pat?
So, if you're involved in a crime and somebody assaults you, you can go to the police and say, okay, I've been assaulted. You get wire transfer requests all the time. And the first question that you go online to file, it says, what was your loss? Well, we try and insure against stupid by making sure that our staff knows that this wire request better be a piece of paper that comes and gets handed. And so we know that it's fake, but there's no avenue to report that.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this is particular. I don't have a thing about cops, but I do see that an evolution needs to take place, especially with local law enforcement, with respect to what their role is in this whole cybersecurity thing. Because what they think their role is we scrape Twitter looking for drug deals. Okay, that's what they think. 60% of domestic violence victims have spyware on their phones from their abuser that's tracking them. Where do you go? Who do you give that to and say, this is going on, this is a crime? Your neighbor hijacks your Wi-Fi to do illegal thing. who do you tell? You can't call the cops. The FBI doesn't care unless you've suffered $25,000 or whatever harm. So there's this huge gap. There's nobody to, so I think in talking to your legislators, especially the ones at the state and local level, we need laws that criminalize things that we can report to local law enforcement, right? And it's, this neighbor on neighbor stuff is absolutely gonna be happening. We've seen it happen already. This thing about spyware on your phone, you know, when you are subjected to a crime, you gotta go tell somebody about that. And right now, there's a whole lot of things that you would consider to be criminal that you can't tell anybody about, because the laws don't exist.
Probably time to go update your router password, you know, and your Wi-Fi key. It's time to change it. You probably had it the same for the last 3-4 years, and it's time to go update it. I remember that case, by the way. It's the guy who incriminated somebody else by using his home Wi-Fi,
Right.
hacking it in, and
Actually, more of a comment than a question for Michael. In the beginning of his presentation, he talked about simplifying things to explain it to executives, and we've leveraged Michael to explain some things to one of our commissioners, which will now lead to more discussion because of the way he takes that approach and puts it in dollars and cents. So from somebody that's been there, it has been very effective for people that, just like we talked about, they didn't understand the technology. They looked in the management team, technology team to figure it out. But if you can put it in those terms, it resonates, it stays with them.
Thanks, bud.
And then they react.
all right, so we're over our time, so I want to thank our speakers and our host for this event. You're here, Mike.
Everyone who registered will get a follow-up opportunity to sign up for Voices for Innovation and to connect with Jonathan and be involved.
Do you want your slides shared? Nothing sensitive?
Excellent.
Yeah, let me clean, I'll give you a clean version.
Okay, that's
You can absolutely share mine. Okay. Since I put together about an hour.
Yeah, I could just do, like, if you want.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll just send it.
Because if you send me now, I'm saying it's okay, I know that's okay.
Okay.
No, we're gonna do that.
Good.
I'm trying to get some mileage out of it. The FBI gave that to me. That one figure.
It's better than a bunch of 17 blocks.
You know, and if that's